The morning of the 7th of June 1944 is overcast and smells of cordite. In the rubble of a stone-walled farmyard on the southern edge of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, Corporal Wendell Oakes of C Company, 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion, is crouched behind a collapsed granary wall with his hands pressed flat against the ground. He can feel the concussions before he hears them. A deep, rhythmic hammering that travels up through the chalk-laced Norman soil and into his palms like something alive. 60 metres to his left, two of the company's 4.2-inch chemical mortars, four deuces, the crews call them, are set up in a sunken lane behind a hedgerow so dense with root growth that it has absorbed shrapnel for 400 years. The tubes are elevated at steep angles. The crews move without speaking. A round goes in, a pause, then a sound like tearing cloth rising, and then nothing until the impact comes from somewhere behind the bluff. Oakes is not supposed to be here in any conventional sense. The 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion was not a rifle unit. It was not supposed to be fighting through Norman villages at point-blank range, trading fire with German strongpoints that had stopped entire companies of the 1st Infantry Division the day before. And yet here, in this cluster of wrecked buildings between the beach and the inland road, the 4.2-inch mortar, a weapon most planners regarded as a specialty chemical delivery system, was being used to do something nobody had fully anticipated: to crack open fortified positions that direct fire weapons could not reach, hidden above sunken lanes, lobbing shells in steep parabolic arcs over hedgerows and onto targets invisible from any flat angle. To understand how a mortar company came to fight a village battle on the 7th of June 1944, one has to go back to the beach itself and to the catastrophic morning of the day before. Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, was one of the most concentrated killing grounds in American military history. The beach stretched roughly 6.4 kilometers between the villages of Vierville-sur-Mer to the west and Colleville-sur-Mer to the east, backed by bluffs rising between 30 and 50 meters, laced with 5 draws, natural exits, each covered by interlocking German positions. The German 352nd Infantry Division, whose presence American intelligence had failed to confirm until the week before the landing, had reinforced the existing Atlantic Wall defences to a degree that fundamentally altered the equation. By 9 o'clock on D-Day, the first assault waves of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had suffered approximately 2,000 casualties. Companies had been reduced to a few dozen men. Officers were dead in the surf. NCOs led where they could. The beach was jammed with burning vehicles, wounded men, and units that had lost all cohesion. The draws themselves, Vierville, Les Moulins, Saint-Laurent, and the others, were the key to everything. Until American forces could push through them and off the beach, there was no breakout, no exploitation, no linkage with the airborne units inland. Each draw was defended by a wider stands nest, a resistance nest composed of concrete emplacements, machine gun positions, anti-tank ditches, and pre-sighted mortar pits. The Germans had spent 4 years building them. Many positions were oriented to fire laterally along the beach face rather than directly out to sea, which meant naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, both of which had been wildly inaccurate in the pre-dawn hours, had done relatively little to them. It was into this context that units like the 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion were feeding ashore, tasked initially with smoke operations and chemical warfare response. but carrying a weapon that a handful of experienced NCOs and junior officers recognised immediately as something far more tactically useful in this landscape. The 4.2-inch mortar fired a 10.8 kilogram round to a maximum range of approximately 4,000 metres. Crucially, it fired at high angles between 45 and 85 degrees, meaning it could drop shells almost vertically into positions that were immune to flat trajectory fire from rifles, machine guns and tank main guns. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, in the sunken lanes and walled farmyards, this was not a minor technical distinction. It was the difference between being able to engage a target and not. By the late afternoon of June 6th, with the draws partially cleared and the bluffs breached at several points, American forces were beginning to push into the shallow hinterland south of the beach. Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer sat roughly 1.5 kilometres inland. It was not a large village, a church, a square, a handful of stone farmhouses, a water mill, perhaps 300 inhabitants before the evacuation, but it sat astride a road junction that controlled movement off the beach and towards the Bayeux Highway. The Germans had organised it for defence. Machine gun nests were positioned in the church tower and in 2 fortified farmhouses on the southern edge of the village. A section of 80mm mortars had been dug in behind a wall on the western side. The fields around the village were mined. The hedgerows channeled any approaching force into predictable lines. The 16th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion had attempted to push through Saint-Laurent during the evening of June 6th and been stopped with significant casualties. 2 Sherman tanks from the 700 41st Tank Battalion had been knocked out on the approach road. A rifle platoon had been caught in the open between 2 hedgerows by the German mortar section and lost 11 men in under 3 minutes. By nightfall, the battalion had pulled back to consolidate positions on the northern edge of the village. The German strongpoints, particularly the farmhouse on the Rue du Moulin and the church tower, remained intact. What changed on the morning of June 7th was the arrival of the 4.2-inch mortars. Captain Herbert Calley, the commanding officer of C Company, 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion, had moved his weapons forward during the night, positioning 2 sections in the sunken lanes north and northwest of the village. He had 3 guns operational. The range to the church tower was approximately 350 metres. The range to the farmhouse on the Rue du Moulin was 420 metres. Both were well within the 4.2's effective range. More importantly, both targets were behind cover that made them invisible from ground level but exposed to plunging fire from above. The first fire mission began at 6:14. The initial ranging rounds fell long, striking a field south of the church. The crew adjusted, dropping tube elevation 2 degrees, and the 3rd round landed inside the church's exterior wall. 2 further rounds followed in rapid succession. A German machine gun crew that had been positioned in the tower belfry was hit directly. Witnesses from the 16th Infantry's forward observers described seeing the tower's upper stonework collapse inward. The machine gun did not fire again. If this deep dive into history interests you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you might think and keeps these stories coming. The second target, the fortified farmhouse on the Rue du Moulin, was harder. The building was a solid Norman structure with walls nearly a metre thick and the German infantry inside had blocked the windows with sandbags and timber. Direct hits from rifle-caliber weapons and even light mortar fire would do little. But the 4.2-inch round at 10.8 kilograms with a high explosive filler was a different matter. The first round landed short in the farmyard. The second struck the roof. The third went through the roof and detonated inside the building. A fourth round, fired 15 seconds later, hit the main doorway. The company of German infantry holding the farmhouse, elements of the 352nd Division's 916th Grenadier Regiment, had been reduced over the previous day's fighting from around 80 men to perhaps 40. The mortar fire killed or wounded an estimated 14 of them in the first 6 minutes of the engagement. The surviving defenders moved to the rear of the building, away from the direction of fire, but the mortar rounds followed them, adjusted by the forward observer who had worked his way to a position on the roof of a damaged barn from which he could see the farmyard. By 6:40, the position had become untenable. A white cloth appeared in the rear window. 11 German soldiers emerged with their hands raised. They were taken prisoner by men of the 16th Infantry's B Company, who moved up behind the mortar barrage. The German mortar section to the west was the third and most dangerous target. Its position behind a stone wall had allowed it to engage approaching American forces with near impunity the previous evening, because any attempt to rush it directly meant crossing 200 meters of open ground. Flanking was complicated by minefields on both sides. Callie positioned his third mortar team in an adjacent sunken lane and began engaging the German position at 7:02. The exchange lasted approximately 22 minutes. The German 80mm mortars fired back. One round landed within 8 meters of the American crew, killing 1 man and wounding 2 others. But they were firing at a target they could not see, guided only by the sound of the 4.2's discharge. The American crew, by contrast, had a forward observer in a position with line of sight, adjusting fire by radio. By 7:24, the German mortar position had been silenced. 4 crewmen were found dead. 1 had survived and hidden in a drainage ditch from which he was extracted 2 hours later. By 8:30 on the 7th of June, the 3 principal strongpoints that had held up the American advance through Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer had been neutralized. The 16th Infantry's 2nd Battalion moved through the village and secured the road junction by mid-morning. 2 German 75mm anti-tank guns that had been positioned to cover the southern road junction were found abandoned. Their crews had withdrawn during the mortar engagement, apparently concluding that the position would be overrun. The road south towards Formigny and the Bayeux Highway was open. It is worth being precise about what the 4.2-inch mortar could do that other weapons available to the battalion could not. The 60mm and 81mm mortars carried by rifle companies were effective at ranges up to 1,800 meters and 3,000 meters respectively, but fired lighter rounds, 1.36 kilograms and 4.5 kilograms, that lacked the destructive effect needed against reinforced stone structures. Tank main guns could deliver sufficient explosive effect, but tanks in the Normandy bocage were extremely vulnerable to close-range anti-tank weapons and were of limited use in the narrow lanes around Saint-Laurent. Field artillery, the 105mm howitzers of the Divisional Artillery Battalion was available, but heavily tasked and difficult to coordinate at close range in a village fight without significant risk of hitting friendly forces. The 4.2, with its steep trajectory, heavy round, and relatively compact crew requirement, threaded a tactical gap that none of these alternatives could fill in this specific environment. This was not a lesson that had been fully anticipated. Before Normandy, American doctrine for the 4.2-inch mortar centered on its role as a chemical weapons delivery system, specifically for smoke and, if necessary, mustard gas. The chemical warfare mission had been part of American military planning since the First World War, and the 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion existed within that conceptual framework. Its crews were trained in chemical operations. Its supply chain was calibrated for smoke and chemical rounds. The fact that it also fired a highly effective, high-explosive round was known. But the tactical application of that round in close quarters village fighting was something worked out on the ground by men like Calais and his section commanders in real time. After Saint-Laurent, the lessons spread quickly. By June 10th, 1944, Vicourt had issued informal guidance to divisional commanders noting the effectiveness of 4.2-inch mortar fire against fortified positions in the bocage. By mid-July, as the American breakout operation, Cobra, was being planned, the allocation of chemical mortar companies to infantry divisions had been reviewed and in several cases increased. The 4.2-inch mortar became a standard feature of American tactical planning in hedgerow fighting in a way that its pre-war doctrine had never fully envisaged. The cost had been real. C Company, 81st Chemical Weapons Battalion, suffered 4 killed and 9 wounded in the Saint-Laurent engagement. Significant losses for a unit of roughly 150 men. The man killed in the return mortar fire, Private First Class Raymond Sutter of Cleveland, Ohio, was 21 years old. He had been in France for less than 36 hours. The 2 wounded men who survived both returned to the unit within 3 weeks. Beyond the immediate tactical result, the Saint-Laurent engagement carried a significance that extended into how American forces understood the landscape they were fighting in. The bocage, the dense network of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and enclosed fields that covered much of the Norman interior, was unlike any terrain American officers had trained extensively for. Its effect was to neutralize the Americans' advantages in armor, firepower projection, and air support, and to create a fighting environment that rewarded the defender at almost every level. Finding weapons and tactics that could restore offensive momentum in that environment was not simply a matter of applying existing doctrine. It required improvisation, observation, and a willingness to use available tools in ways their designers had not fully intended. The village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer today is quiet. The church tower was rebuilt in the years after the war in stone that is slightly lighter in colour than the medieval masonry around it, a difference visible from the square if you know what you are looking at. The farmhouse on the Rue du Moulin still stands, repaired and inhabited. The sunken lane where Calais' crews positioned their mortars on the morning of 7th June is now overgrown on both sides, the hedgerows higher than ever. There is no marker there. There is nothing to indicate that on a grey Tuesday morning in 1944, a handful of men with a specialty weapon no one had expected to be used this way, cracked open a defended village in under 3 hours and opened a road that mattered. Corporal Wendell Oakes, in the accounts he gave to his family in later years, remembered the morning chiefly for the sound the rounds made going out. Not the impact. That was distant, muffled by stone and distance. The discharge was what stayed with him, the sharp, concussive bark of the 4.2 firing, repeated at intervals, echoing off the Norman farmyard walls. He remembered thinking, somewhere in the second or third fire mission, that it was working, that whatever was on the other side of those walls was coming apart. He did not say this with satisfaction. He was careful to note. He said it as a fact. It was working, and that was what mattered. On that particular morning, in that particular lane, in a village whose name he had not known 4 days earlier, and which he would not forget for the rest of his life.